Studies at the University of Minnesota. This partnership, this outreach to the community has been such a benefit, certainly for us in the wider community, and I believe as well to the university. And I'm so pleased with the leadership of Rivel Prell, who has been leading the center as its director now, and has been doing a great job applying the resources of the university to our wider community, thinking about some of the challenges that all communities face and how we can partner across many different ways. And I've been proud to and pleased to be part of its board of directors at the Center for Jewish Studies as well. So I just arrived a couple hours ago from Cornell University, which I believe is where our speaker is going to be having his book published. And I know that one other connection from our speaker, Paul Lerner, that he is going to be speaking about a time in our Jewish history in Germany that connects to this building in some level, and he'll speak a little more to that, but I know that the architect for this building that we're in, Eric Mendelssohn, also designed department stores in Germany, in Breslau, the Petersdorf department store, the Schacken department store. The name Schacken will be familiar to us in different ways. We'll hear more about that. So there are a lot of reasons why having this discussion tonight here makes a lot of sense, and I'm glad that we are here for this together. I just want to alert you to the fact that this is one of many of the community lectures that are happening. The next one, just to keep in the back of your mind, is on February 12th. It's a Thursday, so next February. And the speaker is Sarah Abravier-Stein, who's a professor of history and the chair of Sephardic Studies at UCLA. And she's going to be speaking about a Sephardic journey through the 20th century. And that lecture will be at Adath. If you're not yet on the mailing for the Center for Jewish Studies, please sign in at the table outside, and we'll be sure to make sure that you know about that as well. After our discussion lecture tonight, we are going to have a reception right here. Please stay, schmooze, be here for a little while. And it's now my pleasure to welcome the director of the Jewish Studies program, Professor Lerner.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Spilker. It's always such a pleasure to be here, and our partnership means so much to the center. The Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Minnesota is committed to bringing the exciting work that's being done in the field of Jewish studies and to communities of adult learners in the Twin Cities. Our work as the field of Jewish studies encompasses, broadly speaking, the scholarly study of Bible and rabbinics, the histories of the Jewish diaspora of the world, the poetics of, for example, Spanish Jewry, the Holocaust, the politics and arts of Israel, and the American Jewish experience. Our aim is to let all of you know about the great ways scholars approach these subjects, how, for example, studies of gender and sexuality have reshaped our understanding of the great traditional texts of the Jewish people, how textual study reveals important historical and cultural debates, and how the studies of culture and transnational politics help us to rethink art and poetry. The Center for Jewish Studies takes our public work very seriously, and we care deeply about educating the citizens of the Jewish people who want to understand the history and cultures of those people. We do this work in a lot of ways. We educate undergraduates and have been doing that since the late 60s. Graduate students, more in the last few decades. We offer a Hebrew curriculum, as well as textual, historical, and cultural studies of the breadth and depth of Jewish cultures of the world. Our faculty teaches in departments throughout the College of Liberal Arts, and their research reflects that very breadth. We encourage you, as the rabbi was kind enough to point out, that outside you can sign up for our email list to learn about our seminars, our conferences, and events like this. And as director, I'm always happy to hear from any of you and encourage you to stay in touch. And we look forward to your ongoing support of the Center for Jewish Studies. Before I introduce this speaker, I'd like to thank the staffs of both Mount Zion and the Center for Jewish Studies, and to tell you that we are always honored to say that these lectures are made possible because of the gift in memory of Julia Kay and Harold Segal and the support of the College of Liberal Arts. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Paul Lerner. who's an associate professor of history and director of the Max Kade Institute for Austrian German-Swiss Studies at the University of Southern California. We can make no joke about winter. He's had great weather. He's a historian of 19th and 20th century Germany and Central Europe, and he has particular interest in the history of the human sciences, in Jewish history and gender, and the history and theory of consumer culture. He's the author of a number of works, including Hysterical Men, War, Psychiatry, and the Politics of Trauma in Germany from 1880 to 1930, and co-editor of Traumatic Pasts, History, Psychiatry, and Trauma in the Modern Age, and also co-editor of a wonderful volume, Jewish Masculinities, German Jews, Gender, and History. His lecture tonight is from the forthcoming book that Rabbi Spilker referred to, that will be published by Cornell University Press, and it's called The Consuming Temple, Jews, Department Stores, and the Consumer Revolution in Germany from 1880 to 1940. And it is really such a pleasure to welcome you. So.
Have to move this water. I think it's asking for trouble because I'm going to move the slides forward. So, first of all, I just want to thank both of you for the lovely introductions, and I'm really delighted to be here. I'm grateful to the center for bringing me out. I'm grateful to the community at Mount Zion for having me here. And it's really especially meaningful to be in this building, which was designed by the architect Eric Mendelsohn, who I'll be speaking about a little bit. He won't be the focus of my remarks tonight, but there will certainly be some discussion of him. This picture here on your right is a Mendelsohn building. This is one of 3 department stores that he designed for Zalman Schaken, the Schaken department store chain in Germany. So this evening, I'm going to make the suggestion that the department store was one and indeed the most visible part of a broader transformation in European and North American life that began in the later 19th century and continued through the mid-20th century. It stood at the center of what scholars call a consumer revolution, a set of dramatic economic, social, and cultural changes which altered people's relationship with goods, changed how they spent their time, reconfigured how the genders related to each other, and changed the layout of cities. Along with the other elements of modern consumer culture, the illustrated daily press, the advertising industry, the phonograph recordings, ultimately radio, later television. The department store was the most conspicuous symbol of this modern transformation, the source of powers that contemporaries regarded with a mixture of awe and dread. And the reason, in addition to the fact that it was designed by Mendelsohn, one reason why I have this slide here is to show you the crowds that gathered on the opening day for this department store in 1926 in the German city of Nuremberg, to give you a sense of the tremendous excitement that the opening of the department store would arouse. So this consumer revolution, beginning in the 19th century and reaching fruition really after World War II in the 1950s, brought along what social scientists would call a consumer society, defined by the historian Jean-Christophe Agnew as, quote, a society-wide structure of meaning and feeling organized primarily around acts of purchase. We might fill in this definition by noting that in such a system, patterns of consumption rather than position in production determine one's place in society. Indeed, a society in which consumable objects play a disproportionate role in creating meaning and shaping individual and group identities and experiences. When compared to France, Britain, and the United States, Germany experienced this transformation rather differently. For one, department stores and the other trappings of modern consumerism came later. Decades separated the opening of the Bon Marché in Paris, generally considered the first department store, and the appearance of Hermann Tietz & Co., 1886, often labeled the first German department store. Those stores in Munich. This can be explained in terms of Germany's comparatively later industrialization, the later completion of its rail networks, the the correspondingly belated emergence of a middle class with buying power, and the persistence of cultural taboos against certain kinds of commercial activity. While French, British, and American department stores started in cities like London, Paris, New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago, German Kaufhäuser or Warenhäuser, they're two German words for department store, they began in places like Gera in east central Germany and Stralsund on the Baltic Sea. They only reached Munich and Berlin at the very end of the 1880s and the beginning of the 1890s, 30 to 40 years later than similar establishments opened in France. So German department stores came later, but once they came, they expanded more rapidly, like the German economy, than elsewhere, so that by the 1900s, German department stores outnumbered their French and British counterparts. Above all, German department stores were controversial. While this was also the case in other countries, as we'll see, the German reception of the department store was more intense and more contested. On a cultural level, it was filled with darker themes, a morbid sensibility that coexisted with the excitement that many felt upon their appearance. Finally, related to these other themes, German department stores were nearly all Jewish. Almost all of the entrepreneurs, in fact, had come as part of the massive migration of Jews from the Prussian province Poznan over the course of the 19th century. Jews and the figure of the Jew were thus at the center of the raging controversies around consumer culture in the department store in Germany from the 1880s through the Nazi period and even beyond. So much so that for many Germans, from the late 19th century through the mid-20th, the phrase Jewish department store would have sounded redundant. The great majority of department stores, as I've already suggested, in Germany, 4 of the 5 major chains before 1933, and about 90% of individual stores were in fact owned by Jewish entrepreneurs. But beyond these demographic realities, writers, cultural critics, political agitators, and shoppers associated department stores with Jews in a variety of ways. So this is a cartoon from a satirical paper in Germany. Can you read the caption in case you can't? The man on the left comes into the department store and tells the store owner, who's drawn to look very Jewish, says to him, "I've come to tell you that you've brought me to complete ruin with your dastardly pricing policies. So your prices are so low I can't compete anymore. There's nothing left for me to do but to pull a bullet in my head." And the Jewish store owner says to his Gentile competitor, "May I kindly direct you, the weapons department may be found on the first floor." And I thought this in some ways really encapsulated this dilemma, that you just can't compete with the Jewish department store. Werner Zombart, who was one of the period's most prominent economic thinkers, argued that Jews demonstrated a unique, historically and racially determined aptitude for commercial capitalism. And Jews were then the bearers of economic modernity. He described the department store as a quintessentially modern development and an embodiment of what he called the anonymous, objectifying force of capitalism and marketing, which he lamented were displacing traditional retail practices based on personal connections and loyalty. Operating on a less rarefied level, the pages of Germany's anti-Semitic press rattled on with debates about whether all department stores or only the Jewish-owned businesses deserved to be reviled and boycotted. And the Nazis famously targeted department stores in their 1920 party platform and in subsequent writings and actions. That's just showing the party platform, which was not a binding document, but nevertheless was this first declaration of the principles that at that time the still very new Nazi party stood for. And you see there point 16, which I've highlighted, calls for the immediate communalization or really expropriation of department stores. Simultaneously more neutral and even sympathetic voices, Jewish and Gentile alike, simply assumed the Jewishness of the stores and represented department store owners with what contemporaries understood as typically Jewish features and characteristics. Jewishness was even inscribed onto the stores themselves. For example, in The Great Department Store, a 1926 novel by the Swedish writer Siegfried Sieverts, the store's owner, Jeremias Goldman, collects cartoons and caricatures, one of which depicts a prodigious nose and furrowed brow atop the store's portals. So the store itself has a big nose embodying the characteristics of the Jew. More insidious writings delighted in exposing, or in fact fabricating, the ragged Jewish merchant behind the scenes of the modern glitzy palaces of consumption, alerting readers that the stores, like their owners, were trying to mask their shtetl peddler origins. So this project began from the simple realization that Jews owned most of the department stores in pre-Nazi Germany, and that no one was talking about this striking fact. Having followed the robust and still growing historical literature on consumer culture in other national contexts, it was clear to me that the department store was bound up with crucial changes in daily life, economic structure, or urban organization, and architecture in the modern period. So a handful of Jews, and several non-Jews, were at the forefront of changes that revolutionized modern life. Hence I wondered, did people, other than the most strident anti-Semites, did they think of department stores as Jewish in the late 19th and early 20th centuries? Were they remembered as Jewish later? How did Jewish ownership of department stores intersect with other themes in emergent consumer culture, in economic and business history, and in German and European culture? What does it mean to call something Jewish? Can a business or business niche be Jewish in a meaningful way, beyond just pointing out that its owners happen to be Jews? My approach, and I'll just do a kind of shameless plug for the book, which will be coming out this spring. My approach has been to connect the department store to major themes in Jewish history and the representation of Jews in German culture. So some of the examples, some of the topics I've written about are Jews and circulation and mobility. So just a couple of quick slides to kind of demonstrate. This is an ad for the Karstadt department store in the south of Berlin, showing that it's kind of on the public transportation grid, and all the different train stations come from it, but the department store is in the center. And here's a promotional event at the KaDeWe, probably the most famous German department store, with railroad tracks of all the different vacation destinations on the store itself, and they're selling travel gear in the window displays. And so that's one chapter. Another one is on sexuality and anxiety about the power of Jewish men over German women. I won't go into those two themes much today, but just to give you some illustrations of this kind of anxiety about the sexual universe of the department store. So I've talked about the consumer revolution, but what about the consuming temple? The department store observed Émile Zola in his notes for the novel The Lady's Paradise of 1883, which is really the ultimate department store novel. The department store, he wrote, tends to replace the church. It marches to the religion of the cash desk, of beauty, of coquetry, of fashion. Women go there to pass the hours as they used to go to church. An occupation, a place of enthusiasm where they struggle between their passion for clothes and the thrift of their husbands. In the end, all the drama of life with the hereafter of beauty. In the novel itself, Zola writes of Moret, the protagonist, and this is based on the Bon Marché in Paris, and the founder of the Bon Marché, Aristide Boucicaut. His creation, quote, was producing a new religion. Churches, which were being gradually deserted by those of wavering faith, were being replaced by his bazaar. If he'd closed his doors, there would have been a rising in the street, a desperate outcry from the worshippers whose confessional and altar he would have abolished. So in an age of wavering faith, the secularizing pull of the modern world, the department store steps in to fill the void. Acts of purchase replace religious ritual. Reflecting on Baudelaire's notion that the modern metropolis caused a kind of religious intoxication, Walter Benjamin wrote that the department stores are temples consecrated to this intoxication. For French theorist Jean Baudrillard, writing in the 1960s, just as medieval society was balanced on God and the devil, so ours is balanced on consumption and its denunciation. In other words, in the modern period, acts of consumption and our guilt about consumption, this dilemma takes the place of the moral quandaries of the pre-modern world. So consuming temple was also used by the critical theorist Siegfried Kracauer in a rumination on a lonely mannequin in a shop window, tending to what he called the holy altar of consumption. The Wertheim store on Leipziger Straße, which is pictured here, a central commercial artery in Berlin, was nicknamed the cathedral. And architects like Erich Mendelsohn, more about whom in a bit, consistently compared the medieval Gothic cathedral to the modern department store as the structures which best embodied the spirit of their times. In architectural terms, department stores can also be compared to railway stations or to museums or exhibition halls, all of these structures can be seen as modern iron and glass equivalents of the medieval church. And the department store, above all, stood at the center of the metropolis, atop transportation and public transit grids, and at the heart of new sites of middle-class leisure and entertainment. That's from the same ad campaign that I showed before. Okay, the light corridor, the central atrium in the department store, according to one historian, provided a peaceful respite from congested urban conditions. Time spent in these spaces could be a moving, transcendent experience, conjuring the same emotions as a visit to an urban cathedral. It was also portrayed as an instigator of fantasies, sublime, erotic, even violent, suggesting the tremendous power of the department store over the imagination. So Konsumtempel in German remains a common vernacular term, a kind of ironic highlighting of the secular condition of the modern period, in which we're too cynical to derive meaning from actual devotion to the divine, and in which satisfying consumer desires shapes our identities, gives us meaning, and takes on a wholly ritualistic function. Consuming has another definition, too, a common 19th century usage, meaning destruction. At the time, it denoted destruction of the body through tuberculosis. Consumption is a kind of destruction, too, and I think it's no coincidence that so many imagined department store plots and from this period end in destruction, usually through fire. So in the consuming temple, I take this notion of the department store as a secular temple and tie it into the Jewishness of the department store, and indeed to broader themes around German experiences of and encounters with early mass consumption. The German department store was often portrayed not just as a cathedral, an altar for the worship of the commodity, or a so-called cathedral of consumption, but specifically as a Jewish temple. So let me give an example of this, another example taken from a literary source before I move on. This comes from a 1909 novel called Warenhaus Berlin, or Department Store Berlin, by Erich Kerr, and it offers a thinly fictionalized account of the KaDeWe, the Kaufhaus des Westens, or Department Store of the West, once Europe's largest and most elegant department store, which opened its doors in 1907 and was founded by Adolf, or born Abraham Jandorf, a Jewish businessman who operated 5 other primarily working-class retail emporia throughout the capital city. The novel recounts its protagonist's ascent from a purveyor of dry goods into a veritable department store king, and his ambitious plans to create the eponymous Department Store Berlin. So this is the actual department store that the novel is modeled on, just as the Ladies' Paradise is modeled on the Bon Marché in Paris, Department Store Berlin is modeled on the KaDeWe in Berlin. The proposed new department store's location, consistent with the actual KaDeWe on Berlin's Wittenbergplatz, was problematic for city officials because of its proximity to the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church, which you can see there in the background. Berlin building regulators, this is all within the novel, feared that the department store might block the church, and that, quote, the church's sanctity would be desecrated if the doors to a department store opened right across from its main entrance. The church then provides a backdrop for subsequent events. For example, Kerr writes that on the day of the Department Store Berlin's grand opening, quote, as the chimes of the Kaiser Wilhelm Memorial Church's bell tower trailed off into the clear winter air, the sea of light of the new house flamed up. The juxtaposition of the Christian church and the Jewish temple of commerce, which was in this case a monument to greed and corruption, frames the novel's climactic events, which, like in the novel I mentioned earlier, The Great Department Store, which unfold in a highly allegorical manner. The church itself, a memorial commissioned by the German Emperor Wilhelm II to commemorate his grandfather, Wilhelm I, harkened back to an imagined traditional Germany of throne and altar that lay starkly at odds with the new consumer-oriented modernity furthered by the department store. The appearance of the department store next to the cathedral can be read as reflecting a larger tension in a society that was responding to rapid changes by looking backwards, attempting to revive discarded traditions as they were on the verge of anachronism. The climactic event is a fire in which Milan, the proprietor of the store, on which he sets after learning of his wife's infidelity. Symbolically, I argue, the fire resolves the tension, the provocation of the Jewish department store next to the cathedral in the center of the metropolis. He describes the fire in quasi-biblical terms. It was, Kerr writes, as though the earth reared up in a mighty rage. A huge fist of flame, glowing red, raised itself up, stretched the tower up into the heavens, and then tore it down deep into the ground with an abrupt lurch. The store's entire interior collapsed in on itself with dull claps of thunder. While the fire at the end of the great department store was likened to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, here the allegory more closely resembles the Tower of Babel, when we just read in the Torah this week. Neland's hubris, the majesty and grandeur of his colossal department store, which like in the biblical tale resembled a city, calls upon itself destructive divine wrath. Yet again, the church provides a backdrop, a screen for observing the department store's destruction. Quote, the church stood there like a black silhouette against the burning horizon. In its windows, the eerie beauty of the furious blaze was reflected magically. But with the store's destruction, the provocation of the Moloch, the secular temple of greed next to the church, is resolved, dictating the novel's peaceful poetic ending on a lovely Sunday morning, no less. A thick yellow shower of sparks rained down like a fluttering veil of majestic beauty out into the dark night, writes Kerr. This is also just trying to show how sort of fire and lights are a big part of department store promotions. And one more example of that with an Eric Mendelsohn store here on my left. Actual department store fires were a very serious concern at the time, but that's another topic that I don't have time to go into. Okay, so what was revolutionary about department stores? For many urban denizens starting around 1900, the latest shopping emporium, display window exhibition, or special department store event, like sales, fashion shows, art exhibitions, elicited tremendous excitement. With cafes, newspaper reading and letter writing rooms, hair salons, banks, and travel agencies, the department store was meant to be a leisure destination worthy of devoting a whole day. Its aisles and departments akin to a city within a city, ideal for meandering, sauntering and taking in the attractions. Everything under one roof was a common motto, this in self-conscious contrast to traditional German commerce, in which merchants sold one type of ware, over which they had complete expertise. Brashly breaking taboos, the department store marked a social provocation, a perceived threat not only to existing businesses and economic practices, but to prevailing gender roles and social norms. Unlike traditional specialty shops, which customers generally enter for the purpose of making a specific purchase, department stores welcomed casual browsers. The German term is ohne Kaufzwang, no pressure to buy. They sought to attract as many people as possible and keep them in the stores for as long as possible. Again, completely opposed to what a traditional retailer would, where you come in with a specific goal and leave as soon as you're done. The store's success, as critiqued by many contemporaries, required luring potential customers in and inflaming their desire for goods. Another very rich German term is Kauflust, which is, I've not found a good translation for it other than the desire or the drive to buy or purchase. This became a leitmotif, to use another German term, in department store representations of all kinds, an explanation for the store's power to attract teeming crowds of customers, excited throngs pressing up against the spectacular display windows. These consuming desires were said to be aroused through low prices made possible by the store's high volume and rapid turnover, but were allegedly furthered through techniques of display, presentation, and marketing. For department store opponents, including defenders of the interests of small shopkeepers, the stores baited and trapped unsuspecting customers. They incited Kauflust through trickery and deception, through false advertising claims touting inferior products, and they preyed on naive consumers and circumvented ethical business practices, making it impossible for upright businesses to compete. That these claims contradicted economic realities, indeed a department store's success often translated into greater prosperity for all surrounding businesses, did nothing to diminish their influence or rhetorical power, nor did the fact that department stores never accounted for more than 5% of total retail in Germany before World War II. Women's behavior in department stores was a source of particular concern to many observers, reflecting widespread unease about how and where women spent their time and their or their husband's money. Critics claimed that department stores exerted a nearly irresistible, hypnotic effect on female shoppers, Indeed, the store's lure, the mesmerizing impact of advertising and display, also preoccupied psychoanalysts and psychiatrists who diagnosed epidemic numbers of kleptomania, or magazinitis, you would say, department store-itis, around the turn of the century, and blamed many women's seemingly irrepressible drive to steal on the temptations of the department store environment and the weaker female constitution. And this is a sort of common tricks that kleptomaniacs and department store thieves were allegedly exposed to be using. There's the false arm, where they actually things into anyway, and the case with the false bottom and all kinds of stuff that supposedly went on. Kleptomania was considered so inevitable that in a contemporaneous Austrian play, The Department Store Incident, a wealthy man clandestinely purchased a major department store so that his wife could indulge her stealing habit without legal consequences. Psychiatric case histories described kleptomaniacs' dreams of being possessed by department store demons, compelling them to return again and again. And in a parallel discourse, political agitators used religious and supernatural imagery to characterize the stores as having seductive, even satanic powers, and a parasitic effect on the German body politic. What would today's times be without department stores, asked commentator Walter Schulze in a 1932 text. We need the department store. It belongs to us and we to it. We need these places in which everything is alive, where it pulsates from the first to the last hour of the day. What is it then which makes the department store so magnetic for us? The answer is its magic, its mysterious fluid. There lies the spirit of the department store, which seizes us wherever we find ourselves in it. I think he captures this sense of enchantment, the mysterious allure, the magnetism, the feeling of endless possibility and mobility provided by the department store. So oppositional literature depicted the department store, as I mentioned before, as a Moloch, greedily devouring unsuspecting customers, a monster preying on traditional German businesses, and a vampire or economic demon, as a 1920 work by a Nazi economist had it. Now this image I've never really understood, because the text itself, which is from the department stores of both worlds, meaning the old world Europe and the new world United States, the organization of the great Berlin, Parisian, and American department stores. This is a very sober, boring kind of business account of how these department stores work, and that it's, to me, is very incongruous that it has this image of the department store monster essentially devouring the globe. So this these come from The Devil in the Department Store, which was a story written and drawn by Thomas Henry Heine, who was a satirist who had to leave Germany. And in this story, The Devil in the Department Store, he exemplifies but also mocks these assumptions that there's something satanic going on. Explaining one store's ability to lower prices ceaselessly and devour competitors as the result of a Faustian bargain. So this department store owner makes a deal with the devil that he can continue to lower prices and be profitable, and he drives all the other department stores out of business, and people ask, the kind of honorable merchants all ask the city officials to intervene, and the city officials say, no, there's nothing we can do because our wives will kill us if we make him change what he's doing. He eventually comes up with this plan where he stops lowering his prices, and the devil appears to claim his soul, and it turns out that the Jewish department store owner had actually tricked the devil and put ownership into his wife's name. So he gets off scot-free, except then he dies. Which I think that kind of unhappy ending has something to do with the Nazis being in power by this point, and the Jewish department store owners actually not having a happy ending. Okay, so in the time that remains, I want to focus in on one particular cluster of themes which come out of the 4th chapter of the book, primarily about department store architecture. the Schocken concern, the Schocken department store firm in Germany, and Zionism, which may not sound like it all belongs together. In contrast to the other leading department store firms, Wertheim, Leonhard Tietz, Hermann Tietz, Jandorf, Karstadt, which was the lone Gentile of the major department store entrepreneurs, the Schocken concern got a late start. In 1901, Simon Schocken, aided by his brother Zalman, having left Marganen and Poznan for points further west, opened a branch of the Uri Brothers department store in the Saxon town of Zwickau. Several years later, the brothers went out on their own. By the time of the Nazi assumption of power in January 1933, I. Schocken Sons, Inc. had become Germany's fifth largest department store concern, with 19 of its own establishments and several sister stores, a staff of some 7,000 employees, and rapidly increasing profits. Concentrating in the Saxon kingdom, Schocken stores served a predominantly modestly earning clientele. Stripping their stores of the excess, the fantasy of social mobility, and democratized consumption, in the sense of the department store was claiming that it could give finery to people in the middle class and make them consume like the nobility. So the Schocken stores are doing away with this idea, and they developed instead a rational business plan focused on providing quality merchandise at reasonable prices. Between 1926 and 1931, Zalman Schocken, working most famously with the fellow Zionist architect Erich Mendelsohn, as well as several lesser-known local architects, created some of the most famous examples of pre-World War II commercial architecture. Edifices that are still striking, although many of them no longer exist, but from photographs, still striking for their stark beauty and architectural innovations, their functionalism, their lack of ornamentation, and in short, their modernism. Schocken, who was active in Jewish affairs, and whose publishing house brought out the work of Agnon, Buber, and other leading lights of Zionist thought and Jewish culture, sought to promote a revival of Jewish culture. His Zionism was the cultural kind most associated with Achad Ha'am, more than the more overt political program associated with Theodor Herzl. So I want to conclude by asking how German Zionism, modernist aesthetics, and retail entrepreneurship go together, and how they came together specifically in the history of one extraordinarily successful department store chain. So what I argue in the forthcoming book is that Zionism and architectural modernism shared a desire to break free of the constraints of the past. Both Schocken brothers had long been interested in architecture and aesthetic questions. Zalman was familiar with the Werkbund, whose coffee kettles and table lamps could be purchased at Schocken stores. In fact, in an address at the 1912 Zionist Congress in Posen, he praised Werkbund artists for breaking free of historicist design and superfluous ornament and creating modern functionalist styles. Why did Schocken mention the Werkbund in a speech before a group of ardent Zionists? His less than enthusiastic audience seems to have wondered this too. The connection suggested by his biographer Anthony David was that Schocken hoped to do for Jewish culture what the Werkbund was doing for German design. He sought to put the Jewish people on a new footing by liberating it from debilitating dependence on the past and excessive reliance on German tradition and German influence. Although what's interesting is he does this in a very German way. He wants to sort of come up with a Nibelungen myth for the Jewish people, and all of his models on what a healthy and strong culture are all taken from German culture, but then he wants to run Jewish culture on a parallel path. He remained throughout his life. His greatest heroes were Goethe and Nietzsche and Barton Buber. So it's sort of the highest. German culture and Jewish culture are kind of inseparable, even though he's trying to separate them in a way. So, in addition to independence from national traditions, the Cultural Zionist Project and the Werkbund's modernism shared a utopianism, a desire to remake life, in which material and cultural reform went hand in hand. An earlier generation of department stores, most famously and influentially, I'm not going to go back in the slides, but some of the ones I showed before from the Imperial German era, the very ornate, grandiose ones, had sought to Germanize the department store, to take this phenomenon that was really associated with the French and the United States and with Jews, and to make it German, to root it in German tradition, German market culture from the pre-modern period. So Wertheim, just give me 1 second. So this one, for example, which is the cover of my book, this department store, this is the one that I mentioned that was nicknamed the Cathedral. That was really the ultimate in luxury. The whole point of this department store was to show that a department store could be luxurious, that it wasn't crass, a place for cheap goods, that it was, fancy and had high aesthetic standards, and that it was German. So this store, one of the largest, most luxurious, and most profitable of European department stores, can be read as reflecting the aspirations of its Jewish proprietor, Abraham Wertheim, and its Jewish architect, Alfred Messel, for Germans to accept the department store, which had been coded as foreign, American, or Jewish. The Schocken stores, on the other hand, arose in a different context. Schocken and Mendelssohn's sensibilities were shaped in the turn-of-the-century milieu when mass Jewish immigration, not only from Posen but by Yiddish-speaking Jews from the Russian Empire, who more conspicuously bore the traces of Jewish distinctiveness, along with heightened anti-Semitism, triggered what historians call dissimilation, a turn inward, a rejection of the ideal of German acculturation and a new sense of solidarity with Jews, including new arrivals in the East. The department store, for Schocken, should display its goods in a clear and straightforward manner. It should allow salespeople to help customers make informed, rational choices. Instead of striving for everything under one roof, the Schocken stores concentrated on fewer products, on a discrete selection of types, which they ordered in such great quantity that they could exert pressure on manufacturers to keep costs down. So let me go back to where we were. Instead of evoking a cathedral and inspiring a kind of religious awe in the commodity through, for example, its vertical lines, the Schocken stores were above all horizontal. They had horizontal lines intended to capture the democratism, dynamism, and relentless energy of the modern period. They were the anti-consuming temple. In the great era of commercial construction of the imperial period in Germany, the department store, represented as a Jewish phenomenon, was self-consciously Germanized. In the second great area of department store construction, between the post-World War I economic recovery in 1924 and the crash of 1929, leading architects sought to make it representative of universal values, including objectivity and rationality. That the people behind this development affiliated with the Zionist movement in Germany and helped create the cityscapes of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv in the 1930s, that the modernist department store of the 1920s, let me start that sentence again, sorry, I got tongue-tied there. What I'm trying to say is, so there's this trajectory that the people who created, like Mendelssohn and Schocken, created the modern department store, go on to have a tremendous influence over still today, the physical landscape of today's Israel. Yet at the time, they were also labeled, these modern department stores which are moving beyond the other kinds we saw before, these were also labeled Jewish by department store critics, shows the multiple resonances and the apparent inescapability of the concept of the Jewish department store. Thank you. Yes, I hope I didn't go on too long. I'd be glad to take questions, sir.
Yeah, knowing about the destruction of the Holocaust.
Yeah,
But still, what happened in the stores after it was over?
yeah.
And after the war, did any German Jews, the survivors, go back and reclaim the stores? And who owns them today?
Yes, thank you. Those are great questions. Okay, so basically most of the department stores at the time were, well, let me backtrack. As you know, I showed that slide with the Nazi Party program. So the Nazis were very outspoken critics of the department store. The problem is people like department stores, right? And they, also, the thing that really propelled the Nazis into power was economic crisis and unemployment. So the last thing the Nazis could actually do would be to eliminate department stores, which would then only worsen the economic crisis. And we forget this, but the Nazis, especially at the beginning, really needed to be popular. They cared about public opinion much more than I think we, in our minds, imagine. So there were radicals, so-called Nazi radicals, who wanted things to happen immediately, who wanted department stores to be shut down. There were calls for boycotts. There were picket lines in front of department stores. There was violence outside of them. But for the first few years, the party was very adamant that nothing dramatic be done. In fact, they even, and Hitler himself, authorized a very favorable loan to the Tietz company to keep them afloat because they were on the verge of bankruptcy and they had 90,000 employees. And of the 90,000 employees, actually, I'm sorry, there were 90,000 department store employees throughout Germany, but of the something like 20,000 Tietz employees, only a small fraction of them were Jews. So it was more important to keep the department stores going. By 1936, the Nazi government pushed hard to Aryanize, I hate using that word, but to take businesses out of Jewish hands. And over the years between 36, 37, 30, and the last holdout was 39, the Israel department store in Berlin, they were all sold off to non-Jewish owners at a fraction of their actual value. The Zalman Schocken was the smartest of them all about this. Now the Wertheims, by this time, had converted, most of them had converted and intermarried, and so Gerhard Wertheim put some things in his non-Jewish wife's name, thinking that would protect him, but it didn't. She actually made off with a lot of the profits and dissociated herself from him. The Schocken held on for a long time because he put a non-Jewish friend in charge, based in England. So he was the one who did it best of all of them, but still he didn't do that well. And most of them after the war continued to be operated by non-Jewish Germans. And there were restitution cases, but the restitution cases were usually for the value of the property that the stores were on, not for the businesses themselves. And the Wertheims themselves were swindled by somebody who said, "Don't bother coming back, there's nothing to see, your stores have been completely destroyed, they're valueless, just sell them to me for this amount," which turned out to be, again, a small fraction of what they were worth. And then he immediately turned around and sold them to Karstadt, which was the one non-Jewish chain that still survived. So that's a long answer, but yeah, I kind of threw out historical irony that one of the concerns today is owned by a Jewish investor, or he at least has the major share of one of them. But that's a story that has nothing to do with, he came in much later. So I hope that answers your question.
Today, there's no Jews that own department stores in Germany.
I mean, there's Werner Bergrun, who is an investor, but there are really two department stores in Germany today. There's Karstadt and Kaufhof. Karstadt is the one that was the major non-Jewish one. Kaufhof was the Leonhard Tietz, so there were two Tietzes, and the Hermann Tietz stores became Hertie when the Nazis came to power because Tietz sounded Jewish, but Hertie didn't, and Hertie survived under non-Jewish ownership for years and went bankrupt in the 90s. And Kaufhof still exists, but Kaufhof and Karstadt are essentially merged now and owned by a holding company. So there are really no Jews of any note. Yes, in the back.
The department stores that we show, are they only in Berlin, the pictures that you show us?
Yes, thank you for that question. Most of them were in Berlin, but the Schockens did not have a store in Berlin. So these are, the top is Chemnitz, which was Karl Marx Stadt in the GDR, and then Nuremberg. So the top three were Erich Mendelsohn buildings, incidentally. Stuttgart's the third one, and Waldenburg is actually a pretty small town in Saxony is the bottom one. Let's see, Chemnitz, Nuremberg, Stuttgart. back view of the Nuremberg store, sorry. Anyway, so most of the major ones were in Berlin, but there were also significant department stores in other places. Most of what I talked about here was Berlin, but in the Leonhardt's firm in Western Germany, mostly in the Rhineland, had some very extraordinary stores there, and most of the firms were regional, but then aspired to have a Berlin, kind of an anchor in Berlin. Let's see, yes?
Oh, I'm wondering if and how rhetoric about, anti-Semitic rhetoric about department stores drew on older anti-Semitic rhetoric. I'm thinking especially of money launderers and maybe even blood libel.
Yeah, I think, so if you couldn't hear, the question was whether the anti-Semitic rhetoric in connection with department stores, to what extent it drew on older anti-Semitic stereotypes. And I think it very much did, and a lot of these old themes, they're kind of, well, I was going to say they're subtly there, but anti-Semites were seldom actually subtle, but they're blood libel, or at least this sort of notion that there's this, that Jewish men are rapacious, right, and that department stores are dangerous places for women, right? So most of the customers in these stores were women, and the people at the time would say that men would come in and they would make a plan to purchase and then go, whereas women would spend all day there. So there was this, it was, I would say, culturally a provocation for many to have German women spending so much time in Jewish establishments. So there's this fear of the Jewish men. And that way, money lending, did I say money? Anyway, money lending, money lending, absolutely. There's, I have a lot of material that I couldn't include tonight about the sort of Jews in risk-taking and this kind of capitalism that's very un-German, where German capitalism is cautious and slow, and the Jew is the speculator who's investing and expanding, which also is in the Zola novel. And the Zola character, who's not Jewish, says at one point after he sinks everything into this proposed expansion of the store, he says, "I'm even more Jewish than the Jews." So being Jewish is about risky undertaking and kind of reckless capitalism. So yeah, I think it's all there. Yeah.
How does the story differ, or is it similar in the German-speaking parts of the Austrian?
Yeah. It's a bit different. I did a little bit of work on Austria. There were several major department stores, Katzmansky and Gerngross, exactly, Gerngross were the two. There was Dichter. They weren't quite as controversial, and they weren't as big and important either. Austria was a more controlled economy, and there was kind of less room for this kind of freewheeling economic behavior. But the basic outline of the story is pretty much the same. I mean, through when the Nazis came into Austria, or when Austria was annexed to Germany, the department stores were immediately forced out of Jewish hands, very violently. So I think the cultural response is similar, but they weren't quite as big a topic in German Austria. Yeah.
Let me ask you a question. We had an entrepreneurial history of the appearance, the first emergence of the department stores in German cities. And I'm wondering just what it was about opening a department store, investing in a department store, that attracted at the outset Jews in Germany, Jewish businessmen, Jewish entrepreneurs, and far more than non-Jewish ones. And I kept kicking around in the back of my mind when growing up in Los Angeles, since you live there. This curiosity of Jewish small and medium-sized businessmen who are overwhelmingly the founders of film studios when that was a new and risky form of venture. So what is it about the department stores in Germany and these German Jewish merchants who themselves come from small and medium business ownership?
Right. I mean,
why them and not non-Jews?
well, I think You almost answered your own question. Yeah, so I don't have a definitive explanation, but I speculate a little bit about it in the book, and, but the book really isn't about that. And so as is embedded in your question, different ethnic groups or different migrant groups often take over different business spheres, right? And we see that in all kinds of business activities today still. And these families, many of them were from the same region. They were interconnected, they were intermarried with each other, and they cooperated in a way that made it easier for them to work to succeed. So that's another part of the answer. And a third thing I would mention is that because Jews were excluded from certain professions in Germany historically, and guilds were not open to Jews until pretty late, to make it economically, Jews had to take risks in Germany, right? So more traditional paths were closed to them, so this kind of entrepreneurship was something that non-Jews were less likely to need, which again reinforces a lot of these stereotypes, kind of are reinforced, how can I put it? They're because of certain conditions that keep perpetuating them in turn, right? So Jews are speculators, money lenders, because they couldn't do other things. And Christians historically were not allowed to be money lenders, and then Jews get this reputation, right? So Jews, like other immigrant groups, you have to try something new, you have to speculate, you have to work harder, you have to take risks, right? All these things that we see even today with immigrant groups, that these are what Jews did in the 19th century, and then Jews are in turn characterized as a group that does that.
So I'm sure that you, of course, know that one of the interesting things about department stores in the United States was that women were employed as salespeople.
Yeah.
And that there was a lot of debate about whether they, in fact, it was a channel for prostitution.
Yeah.
So that here's this spirit you described with men and women having contact with each other, but it's not Jewish, so to speak, but it's gendered.
Yeah.
And many Jewish women really aspire to work in department stores because
It's good work.
in unionized factories, but it was closer to Americanization. So I wonder if you talked about owners and consumers, and so could you say something about who sold and what the dynamic of that was?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's relatively similar to the American case in Germany. The workforce became increasingly feminine as things went on, and so the department stores generally started as small-time operations that were family-run, and men and women would work together. But as they expanded and took on more and more non-relatives as employees, they became the people at the time observed this kind of creation of an anonymous workforce, or this, no longer this patriarchal family relationship, but this kind of cogs in a giant machine things happening. So I have all the statistics in my book, and I can't remember them offhand right now, but something like 2/3 of department store workers by the 20s were women, maybe even more than 2/3. But there was still a real gender division in, men got paid more, women did most of the selling, but men sold certain objects that were considered for men. Men sold men's suits, men sold certain other kinds of masculine products that women weren't supposed to be selling. So department store work was considered good work if you could get it, but at the same time it was very hard work, and there's I have a lot of material about how long the work day was and how few breaks you get and how you get in trouble if you're anything, using the informal the do instead of the Z with a customer could get you fired. Speaking on getting a private message during work hours could get you fired. I mean, there are very strict regulations because it was important that everything be as professional as possible, precisely because of this notion of prostitution. And I have some material about prostitution, both the idea that department store workers are prostitutes, but also where the Carnivets in Berlin was a strip that was a notorious strip for streetwalkers to go down in the 20s. And there's this Jewish writer who did this sort of geography or topography of the decadent Berlin, and he wrote, well, I won't go into the graphic details, but anyway, you can find a particular kind of streetwalker in front of the Carnivet. Anyway, I have to remember where to sing up. So, I don't know if I've answered your. Yeah. Okay. But yeah, I mean, I didn't talk so much about gender and sexuality tonight, but. Okay.
Anything further you can extrapolate from the German experiences, how the U.S. system of department stores developed? Because, as we all know, some of them have great department stores were Jewish days.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say the main difference is that in the U.S. there were debates around department stores too. There was an attempt to have special taxes for department stores, which were instituted in Germany. There were most department stores here were also owned by Jews. The main difference I would say is that the debates ended by World War I. And by the First World War, American department stores were no longer controversial. The anti-department store movement had really given up. But in Germany, things got started again after World War I, and we all know what happened. So that would be, I think, I guess, part of it is about anti-Semitism, but another part of it is about Germans' discomfort, really, with the modern economy and with modern commercial capitalism. And in this country, that discomfort went away pretty emphatically, right? I mean, we are the ultimate market economy. And Germany was ambivalent about the market economy for the longest time. So otherwise, I don't know that much about American department stores that isn't kind of common knowledge. I mean, most of them were Jewish owned, and they had their heyday, I would say, really after World War II until about the 1970s, when their share of overall retail began to decline. In Germany, the peak was 12.4% in the late 50s, and since then, department store share has declined pretty steadily, and I believe it would be pretty parallel in the U.S. I mean, we're in the city with the Great Mall of America, so I should be able to say something more about the changing nature of retail, first with malls and then after that with e-commerce, but I don't have anything that I can add to that you all can't think of for yourselves.
And in this town, all the department stores except one downtown is Jewish owned.
In Minneapolis.
We have no department stores in town. Minneapolis did not have that same mix. There were almost no Jewish departments. There were no Jewish department stores. There were Jewish specialty shops. There were no department stores.
That's interesting.
Let's take one more. There was one more question. Wasn't there one other question over here? So let's call it in.
I wondered if the same thing was happening in France and some of the other countries. Were their department stores also owned primarily by Jewish?
There were several French department stores that were owned by Jews, like the Lafayette, and there were several British department stores like Marks and Spencer. But the percentage of Jews in the department store sphere is much lower. So there are a few notable ones, but overall not that many. And I think that's another reason why, or at least the controversy, I mean, even about non-Jewish department stores in France, you get some of the same anti-Semitic propaganda, but it all kind of, it was over much earlier than in Germany.